Okay, recording in progress. Marc, we're very, very happy to have you here via Zoom. But as I said, it's like I really hope we're going to see each other in October in person in Lisbon at the Time conference, and also organize a visit of our lab at that point, because I can see a lot of like collaboration happening, a lot of like bridges. So Marc, you have the floor. You have roughly around 40 minutes, 1 hour, and then around 20 minutes for discussions.
Very nice. Okay. Well, thank you, Anna, for the invitation to your fantastic lab, and thank you, Anna, and team of Anna. Yeah, it was very nice. Also, this the conversations, email with Julia, and were very nice and straightforward. And now I'm here, and I'm happy to talk about my work, which has some sort of gained more importance, I think, because of two meta-analyses which were published in March, which I will talk about, which confirm my initial hypothesis about that the insular cortex is very much the most prominent, maybe, area of the brain and important for our sense of time. And what I want to talk about first is the question of why it is so hard to find basically confirmations or conclusions among different researchers on which brain areas are involved in time perception. And what I always like to say, okay, we have 10 researchers. If we ask them, and we actually did this once, I show you a slide, and then we'll end up with 12 different models. 12 different, even, let's say, psychological and neural models of time perception. I will discuss a little bit about how this may happen, why this may happen. And then I'll talk about my line of research on embodied time. That's already the philosophical term. And we'll talk not only about current and my own, but also historic evidence, which all come together to this the answer of how body signals inform us about the passage of time. Then, in the end, in the same way of reasoning, when I'm talking about how the body makes us sense subjective time, I'll talk about other states of consciousness where in different induction methods like meditation, floating tank, psychedelics, time and body are down-regulated, and again showing how, in general, you could speak about time and the body itself being up and down-regulated in different states of consciousness. But I want to first start with a shocker, with Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, an idealist philosopher. You see his work published in 1809 and 1800, and the first phrase is something like in general philosophical, and the second one concerns specifically time. And I've never presented it, but I'm really quite fond of these two quotes. That's why I want to start with it, because they're very much related to my own work. And so there's Safransky rephrasing, Heidegger rephrasing, Schelling, and this rephrasing would be, let's say, state, nature opens her eyes in humankind and notices that she is there. What this means would be, my paraphrase of this is, through me, nature recognizes that it exists. When a human being becomes aware of herself, nature becomes aware of itself. So this is for me like a shocking for me, the most important philosophical statement, because it means like self-conscious, because we are part of nature, we become aware of ourselves, and therefore nature becomes aware of itself. This could be, in modern terms, a dual aspect monism idea. But then the second part, coming to time is not something that runs independently of the I, but the I is time conceived in extended activity. So this extended in bracket was in the following sentence and really related to the sentence. So meaning time and self are one, and self arises through proactive and temporally extended activity. And this is basically also my conclusion at the end, but Schelling, some sort of, in very difficult terms, also tried to convey this message. Okay, now back to our modern times, 21st century science. And if I talk about time perception, we probably have to talk about two different domains, which are also very important, relating to the structures of the brain, which are govern our sense of time. And one is about temporal processes in the brain, which are involved in the timing of actions. You could say event synchronization. The three pictures on the left are some like expose this, when we try to hunt, when we dance, the quartet in the music, to be able to perform adequately, we have to time in the milliseconds range. If I'm in the dancing situation, if I'm a little too fast or a little too slow, I may step on the foot of my dancing partner. So that is very, very important. And so this relates a lot, I would say, in philosophical terms to inactive timing ideas, and I would say the supplementary motor area, which is dominantly involved. But time is also an experience, and this little photo from the Wikipedia page on boredom explains this, that, and I say it's a key to understanding cognition and emotion, and it's all related to longer time intervals, multiple seconds, and that's where I think embodied time perception, insular cortex activity comes into play. In general, so if you look at, let's say, still in cognitive psychology, let's say, there's a nice distinction between retrospective time perspective, meaning looking back on an interval, and there, importantly, the memory contents and amount of changing experience are very much important. So the classical things in vacation and highly emotional activities, subjective time expands. When we look back, we had an exciting weekend in Lisbon, let's say, and then we come home and feel, oh, time stretched so long. But in our everyday routine, which is a time killer, subjective time seems much, much shorter, because not so many memory contents are basically can be actualized in memory, can be actualized at the moment when looking back. That's a retrospective time perspective. So memory is very much important there. But the other thing which I will be talking about is prospective time perspective, Also, you could say experiencing time at the present moment. And why is it prospective? Because we're always directing towards the future. And there important is that it's all about attention to time or distraction from time. There's a huge body of evidence in cognitive psychology. And so, for example, waiting time and boredom, time passes slowly because we are tending to time. But if we are distracted from time, let's say in a pleasurable activity, or we are chatting with a friend, and time passes very quickly because we don't attend to time. But there comes also this is mystery of subjective time, I would like to say, because what are we attending to if we say we are attending to time? We're not thinking about the clock, but even without clocks, we have this impression of subjective time expansion. And how does this happen? And that's a mystery, because there is no, let's say, modality for time. There is no sensory organ for time, etc. But still we talk about the perception of time. So how is this possible? And the classic cognitive model, so I want to introduce here, this is not how the brain works, but it's a very good heuristic to understand subjective time. I'll just go quickly through this pacemaker accumulator model from cognitive psychology. And the idea is that there is a pacemaker which sends out pulses which are accumulated in this accumulator. And let's say that's why, let's say, after 8 seconds or 8 seconds feel longer than 4 seconds, because more pulses have accumulated because of the longer time interval. But importantly, only pulses go only into this accumulator if we actually attend to time. If we're not attending to time, these pulses don't accumulate, and therefore time passes more quickly, subjectively. And there's a second say modulator next to attention, that's the arousal mechanism. So the pacemaker does not, let's say, have always the same pace, but it can be more aroused or more slowly. And this pacemaker, this pace basically defines also subjective time. More arousal means more pulses are accumulated, less arousal, we are more quiet in our bodies. The faster passage of time, because less pulses accumulate. So that is the cognitive model. And so we try to some sort of look at this in an ecological, valid environment, a little study we did, meaning real waiting under uncertainty for exactly 7.5 minutes, where we had a little cover story and told people, oh, come into the lab, we'll have a computerized timing task and you have to do this. And then they sat there, filled out some paperwork, and at some point we said, oh, please, our computer next door broke down, please wait here. And beforehand, we are taking away everything that could distract them, books, cell phone, of course, and any reading material. So we wanted to have a situation where they're totally alone with themselves in this highly boring and horrible room, where we would suspect their attention to time is high, arousal level is higher, and what happens then? And the results were something like in 2 different studies. The more arousal, so in the subjective scales, we assessed that, the more arousal people felt, the more thoughts about time. So these are the 2 modulators of subjective time, yeah, which resulted in more boredom. The longer subjective duration, the slower passage of time. So this is like a little trying to probe this cognitive model with the arousal and attention to time modulators. Yeah, okay, so this is all good. So, but then if you look, well, this is the dominant model in cognitive psychology, but it's already quite a while, 2009 with Virginie van Wassenhof, we edited this special issue of Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society, and we invited a lot of the most prominent researchers of the time in psychology and neuroscience to give their opinion about subjective time. If we count now across all these different articles, the different functional principles, I'm not reading all these and I'm not explaining these all. This is just to show, name dropping wise, how many different models there are, but also then looking at brain location, which are supposed to be the dominant brain locations. You see there's no agreement on processing models, and there's no agreement on neural substrates. And this is really something special, because this means if you would have a chapter on time perception in a neuroscience book, there wouldn't be, depending on the author, you would have completely different answers on this question, where time is located and which processing models are the most important. What are the sources of this difficulty? And so I'll just go quickly through these. Yeah, so for example, if you look at the literature, there's always several patient populations, or in neuropsychology, which have impairments in time perception, like patients with lesion to the cerebellum, with lesion to the cerebral right hemisphere, but also patients with Parkinson's disease, or the basal ganglia involved, have problems in timing and time perception. But that's important. Impairment does not mean a breakdown in performance. They're still able to time, but they're just more variable, less precise, less accurate in time perception. Then we have different transmitter systems which seem to be involved. Dopamine, serotonin, but also GABA has been shown to some sort of influence subjective time in healthy individuals. And then with TMS, TMS, which transiently impairs timing in the frontal cortex, in the cerebellum, so these regions which you can access with the TMS. Again, okay, so we can manipulate different areas, different transmitter systems, and still there's always some sort of impairment. And then neuroimaging studies, of course, have always multiple brain areas activated. So this leads us to maybe the conclusion there could be multiple parallel neural systems for the processing of time. And this is an example of actually quite a good neuroimaging study, where they try to have a control condition to the timing condition. And now you see here how many different areas of the brain are activated. Timing, in this case of 600 milliseconds duration, versus a control condition. And then you basically could cherry pick. So I would pick insula, of course, you will see later, and say, yeah, I'm the winner. But others would pick frontal cortex or parietal cortex or the cerebellum. So you see, this is, let's say, the problem we were facing. We'll come to this later again with these latest meta-analysis we have in the literature now. So where and how in the brain? So first of all, my answer on how I came to this conclusion. That was when I was in San Diego at UCSD doing 2 fMRI studies where I could replicate myself. 2 years apart, 2 neuroimaging studies. So what I'm showing you is really replicable. And the task, I'll talk about this a little more in detail because I'll use this task later also for different studies. And we had duration of 3, 9, 18 seconds sinus tones. And we had a secondary task that prevented people from counting. And first you listen to a certain tone with a certain duration, 3, 9, or 18 seconds. Then there was a pause. Then a second tone appeared. And people were supposed to press the second tone when they thought, now the second tone is as long as the first tone. So this is a classic duration reproduction task. And we had a control task to this, so we could make the contrasts between these conditions. So I show you now this. So the first part is we have the contrast. So we find a lot of different regions of interest. Again, just like this table I showed you before, we again had a lot of different areas of activation, regions of interest showing up in the timing task. But then we looked at the time activity curves because we had 9 and 18 seconds. So the TR, the repetition time in neuroimaging is 2 seconds. We could have a look at every 2 seconds what's happened in the brain. And so that's something special because normally people look at the milliseconds time scale or a few seconds time scale, and then there's no time course to look at because it's just too short. But here we could look at the time course in these regions of interest. And only in the insular cortex, we showed this increasing activity over time, which ended at the end of the encoding duration, at the end of the tone, which had to be timed. This is the 18 seconds condition. Again, the same thing, though, increasing activation over time, which ended roughly at the end of this time interval. So increasing activity in insular cortex shows up with increasing duration. So this was the empirical finding, which we replicated then 2 years later. And then the question is, well, what is the insular cortex? So in your lab, I don't have to talk too much about the insular cortex. So just roughly, yeah. So for those people maybe who are not so familiar with that, so it represents the physiological conditions of the body. So it's important for the homeostatic regulation. For example, when we have thirst, hungry, temperature, pain, etc. But also it's important if you think about Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis or the James Lange theory, not to go too much into details there, but the interpretation of the physiological states leads us also to our complex human emotions. And there are many neuroimaging and lesion studies showing how the insular cortex is related to physiological needs, to emotions, even complex decision making. You can think about the gut feeling, the proverbal gut feeling, in music perception and meditative states. It's all about the body. So Bud Craig, for example, termed this as the primary interoceptive cortex, the insular cortex. So the working hypothesis stemming from this work from 2010 and 2011 was that, yeah, so maybe it's what we had before was these like abstract pulses, from cognitive psychology. What is that? But maybe it's more the body states, interoceptive signals, which accumulate important for the encoding of duration. It would fill this model. And so one could say that time is not perceived in the outside world, but through interoception by the material self. And this very much relates to Maurice Merleau-Ponty with his phenomenology of embodied cognition. And he actually states, even related to time perception, very similar things, just from the phenomenological analysis he did. So looking at this model again, so we have maybe what was furthermore the pacemaker in this cognitive model is now body states, and the accumulator, some sort of maybe the insular, but this is just a working hypothesis. It's not too strict in these terms. But then you could say, what are the modulators of time? Could be like attention to bodily states, meditative states, waiting time, we attend to our body and time stretches, or increased bodily arousals in affective states, again, leading to a stretch of subjective duration. Yeah, and then, okay, I'm here sitting now in Freiburg, and Hugo Münsterberg, yeah, an interesting person. He, from 1889, he's published a work. He is important because he studied with Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, so he was an experimental psychologist, and founded in Freiburg one of the first experimental psychology labs, and then by invitation of William James moved to Harvard in 1892. But he did an empirical study, so just round the corner where I'm sitting now, and in 1889 published, where he had used a very similar duration reproduction task I used, and with intervals between 6 and 60 seconds. And he showed that the temporal reproductions were most accurate when the onset or the offset of the intervals coincided with the breathing in. Of course, the subjects were not aware of this, but that's when analyzing these two, the stimulation and the breathing in and breathing out cycles. And so this is the conclusion of Münsterberg. Couldn't even see so long ago. The sense of time relies on the sensation of tension in different organs, which are caused by muscle constructions. And that's what was his conclusion. Yeah, 122 years later, now looking at the heart, and this is a study I did with Karin Meissner in Munich. So again, the same duration reproduction task I showed you before. Now we just recorded the heartbeat. And what we showed was, so you see here on the right, I don't know, you see this the cursor position or something here? So, okay. So you see here, this is the encoding phase. This is the reproduction phase, and here's the pauses between encoding and reproduction, the two tones, and here's the intertrial interval. So you see here, the heartbeat slows down step by step during these intervals of multiple seconds, 8, 14, 20 seconds. And you see this linear trend, which correlated positively with the duration reproduction performance. So the steeper the slope, the longer the reproduced duration. So this is now, beforehand we had insular, but this is just, let's say, brain activity. And now we have the direct relationship between heart rate and timing. And then I want to point to Alice Tekil's working group, together also with Cecilia in Rome, who did tremendously interesting research, which, let's say, 8 to 10 years later followed my work. And I'm so happy that an independent research group partly reproduced, but then even excelled with their results. So what they showed in 3-4 very nice papers was, for example, they had a certain duration reproduction paradigm, and they showed that the timing accuracy of the duration reproduction task with irregularly presented numbers. So in between the empty intervals, numbers would appear, but at irregular times, was predicted by the amount of the interoceptive awareness people had, which was assessed by a bodily self-awareness questionnaire. So people who were more self-aware of their bodily feelings were more accurate in timing in this irregular condition, but not in the regular condition where you would have, let's say, regular presented numbers, where you would have some sort of timing in the stimulation outside. Yeah? So meaning in the irregular condition, you couldn't basically time yourself to the external world. So therefore you had to rely on your bodily sense. And then they continued with this, was a behavioral part, and then later they showed with an fMRI study that the posterior insular connectivity with putamen and precentral gyrus, with the 3 nodes they were looking at, and this connectivity, the strength of connectivity was modulated by individual interoceptive awareness with this questionnaire. And this correlated with the irregular condition only, again, when there was no external sense or presentation of time cues, and not with the regular timing condition. So again, insular activity basically is important for your sense of time in the outside world. Then one more, 2023, very nice. You know, we are looking at the time intervals. I showed you multiple seconds intervals up to 20 seconds. Now we're going to the very, very short time range. And we have work of Sadeghi, was basically coaching her a little. And she showed how the pre-stimulus heart rate, so a relaxation response, basically relatively expanded duration. So when people were, the heart rate was lower, more relaxation, people relatively thought that the duration was longer. And then Irina Arslanova from London, she showed that when the stimulus was presented at diastole, so again in this relaxed state of the heart, duration again was relatively expanded. So even though we're talking about the milliseconds time range of very, very short intervals, shorter than 400 milliseconds, and the body states, the heart states, determine subjective duration in the milliseconds. And now coming to this overview, there were in March 2023, we had 2 independent meta-analyses with approximately 100 fMRI studies on time perception that had so far been published. And so you see what we showed before, what I showed before with this cherry picking table. Everyone could just pick their favorite brain area, which they then claim is most important. I would pick, of course, insular cortex. But here now, all these tables are entering these meta-analyses. Yeah, so all this noise that comes with these tables is now basically reduced, subtracted, because now over 100 studies, what happens is what is really there across 100 studies, and it's 2 areas only now. And it's the supplementary motor area, SMA, which is probably important for sensory motor timing. So we have now, talking philosophical terms, inactive consciousness, and bilateral insular, where I would say that's about interoceptive time perception, or in philosophical terms, embodied consciousness. And especially important in the insular was that it was the most important brain area across all time scales, millisecond to multiple second ranges. Okay, so I talked about earlier multiple parallel neural systems for processing of time. And maybe that's also having to do something with the self-awareness continuum, where if you look at this triangle, if self-awareness is highest, like in Alicia Teggel's study, where there is irregular cues, you have to rely on yourself, or with my boring sinus tones, nothing's happening there. There's a lot of internal focus, no external cues, and then we are talking about insular perception. But if self-awareness is lowest, if you have an external focus on external cues, then maybe it's more about sensory motor timing and SMA. So, or even if we are something more passive, if you're totally immersed, absorbed in an activity, could also be passively watching a film, let's say, then insular is not so active, and then time flies very quickly. Okay, with this background, now we can state that emotions, the body, and time, they are all very much related, and there are hundreds of studies, like Sylvie Droit-Bollet in France, or Ruth Ogden in Liverpool. They have shown how stimuli with emotional content are judged to last longer. You have individuals with high body temperature, fever, overestimate time. A very nice study, I thought, was how time passes more slowly when smokers have physical urges to nicotine, but they're not allowed to smoke. And then people some sort of assess their subjective passage of time, and it totally dragged for them. Yeah? But also there are studies also in social psychology that how that surprise or effortful self-regulation correlates with an overestimation of duration. Or during body-focused meditation, at the beginning at least, for people who are not so, let's say, experienced in meditation, subjective time expands. And a lot of people stop meditating at some point because they cannot come over this initial boredom with their body focus, and time drags. Next step, but just shortly, because that would be probably a different talk, but especially in Anna's lab, people know a lot about this. So I just have 2 slides, but then later on, if we discuss more, we can talk about this. So what we show in psychopathology is a over-representation of self and time. Yeah? People overestimate duration. They report a slowing down of subjective time or being stuck in the present. So this is a patient with depression. I did my study at UCSD in San Diego with patients in rehab, drug dependent, showing this familiar experience. But in general, you could say impulsivity as a symptom of psychiatric neurological syndromes is related to this overestimation of time. And there is almost like a sketch of a review, because there's actually not so there are probably not so many studies from Italy. A working group showed that how time process, interoception, and insular activation were related to each other. So again, showing that clinical disorders with some sort of abnormal activity, insular, and some sort of impairment in time perception. And this is one of my favorite historic studies. Yeah, so this by Gabriel Revon-Dallon. In 1905, he published this, so it's in French, and he describes a female psychiatric patient, Alexandrine, and what she showed or reported in the discussions with the doctor was that she had no sense of bodily feelings and urges. And the doctor made some mean little tests with her with ice water in the ear, needle pricks, and she didn't react to that much. And she also had no emotional feelings. So she had physiological reactions to emotions. Let's say when she talked about something that was sad, she had tears, but she reported not to having feeling or sentiment in this case. And she didn't have a sense of time. So you can have body, emotion, time. And so she could have cognitive control through newspapers, daylight, or clocks. That was because she was cognitively very aware, but she had no subjective sense of duration in the seconds to hours range. And also Revon-Dallon, he made some tests with metronome speeds to see whether she could differentiate different metronome speeds, where she was then also quite impaired. And this is now the translation of Revon-Dallon's summary is: the duration perceived by consciousness is nothing less than visceral sensibility. We have something resembling internal clocks made up of various physical rhythms supplied by signals from our gut, bladder, lungs, arteries, and heart. Sorry. So you see how they're very nice historic papers, which we can bring to our days and put them into the context of our newest results. So my hypothesis now is self-body consciousness and time consciousness are both up and down regulated. And this, of course, is also more prominent in altered states of consciousness. So in the last part of my talk, I want to talk about this up and down modulation through altered states of consciousness. So if you talk, I've talked a lot about the self, and now I'm talking about the lab, who knows much more about the self than I do. But let's say, giving a little summary, if we could talk about two different senses of self: the bodily self and the narrative self. And in philosophical terms, you could talk about minimal self, extended self, the self-awareness, me here and now, related to the bodiless self, body awareness, or the extended self, the meaning getting lost in thoughts, memories, future plans, etc. And on the neural level, we have like a nice differentiation: the interoceptive system, including insular cortex, and for the narrative self, we have the default mode network, the singular gyrus, cortical midline structures. And this is, let's say, if I had presented this 5 years ago or something, this would be like agreement on this. But now we get more and more research where the separation some sort of merges, and maybe we have to talk about a network for the sense of an I, where we have the posterior insular cortex, the posterior singular cortex, and the precuneus. But this is just an open discussion, and so we have to expand a little, maybe this minimal bodily self, the I feeling of I, to these posterior parts of the brain. Okay, this is a little recap a little bit. Okay, boredom, waiting time, intense, negatively felt overrepresentation of time on itself, and flow states is the opposite. I haven't talked so much about that, but I will talk more and more about this also concerning altered states of consciousness. We're absorbed in activity like playing a video game, and then there's an underrepresentation of time and self, and you would say, oh, what? It's already 5 hours have passed, but the person was playing video games, maybe even in VR. And yeah, we try to do this, a little study here, video games in VR for inducing flow states. So flow states, as you know, by Csikszentmihalyi defined is an intense and focused concentration on the present moment, a loss of reflective self-consciousness, and a distortion of temporal experience, and very often as peak states, a loss of the sense of time. And we did this in my lab in Freiburg, also with Shiva Koshnod and Federico Alvarez, Hans Rudrecht, the first author. And we had this game, the Thumper game, which we used in 2D on the screen or in VR. And what we showed is a very engaging, very dynamic game. And the more people experienced flow, the faster time passed for them. So this is just a little empirical proof, because what we found out looking at the literature is there's a lot of discussion of the flow states, but it has hardly ever been shown in a systematic, quantitative way. And that's what we did with this video study. So coming now to altered states of consciousness. So first of all, what we very often have is, and in these different states, and I will basically now talk about meditation, flotation, rest, and psychedelics, is an intensified self-experience, a slowing down of time in this experience, but at some point, something like ego dissolution or the dissolution of time and space can happen as peak experience. And I could also talk about other aspects like sexual orgasm, drinking wine, forest bathing, dance, listening to music, prayer, endurance running. These are also other fields I have partly looked at, but I will now focus on these three domains. But before, I will show you one red wine study, which we conducted in Lisbon, where the leading researcher was Rui Miguel Costa, and Arlindo Madeira, who is here. He's also a second author. He's also a professor for tourism in Lisbon, and he has the wine bar called Corkscrew in Lisbon. So you can visit Arlindo and talk about but only after you have read this paper, appeared in PLOS ONE. And just a short summary is the red wine. After consuming red wine in the Corkscrew, either alone or with friends, people reported, not surprisingly, increased pleasure and arousal, a decreased awareness of time and increased attentional focus on the present moment, decreased body awareness, they had more imagination, and they had an increased sensation of oneness with the environment, which is very important as a main feature of altered states of consciousness. So, and this was about 2 glasses of red wine. Okay, this is just as an interruption on my red wine study. I'm very proud of, because it was in a real ecological, valid environment. But let's go to meditation. And first, I want to introduce you this highly experienced meditator, Tilman Lundrup-Borgert. He's actually from Freiburg. He's a medical doctor. And now look at his experience. I analyzed him, that's already nearly 10 years ago. And then he had 35 years of experience in meditation. So now it's nearly 45 years. And for 21 years, he was a monk in a Buddhist monastery in France. And just imagine this, for 10 years, he meditated 12 hours per day. So just imagine this, this experience. And then if I try to calculate a little bit this experience, and we come up to over 50,000 hours of meditation. And I asked him in my book on altered states of consciousness, and presented it there, what is this experience? And he responded in this book: the timeless awareness during meditation is an awakening. It has no beginning and no end. This timeless time is an immersion into a being where no comparing happens. When we are comparing, there are always relations between a before and an after. It is timeless presence without the sense of an I, without observer. perception and perceiver are one. So it's non-dual awareness. There's a lot of self-referential wording in this, but it's probably because it's so difficult to talk about this. And later with Cyril Costinus, we interviewed Tillman again about one specific incidence he had when he was in fMRI. We published an fMRI results on what happened when he was in one of these deep meditation states. And he describes this pure consciousness as a kind of ephemeral afterglow in the form of a maximally abstract phenomenal quality, which he calls luminosity, reportable when he transitions out of the non-dual states. And that's important. Only when he transitions out, there's some sort of reportability possible, but there's no memory of the absolute non-dual state. Basically, you could say there's basically, in experience, there's nothing. Experience is only at the transition point when he transitions out, and there's some sort of traces of what has happened to him. It's still very important. Difficult to explain. So that's why we did a study with more quantitative things. Yeah? And I'll just report about this. And this is a study that was conducted by Damisela Linares Gutierrez, yeah, who was my doctoral student. And what she did was she had 22 very experienced meditators. Yeah? So you see the age range, nearly 50 years, different meditation types, but they're all of this, what you could call more mindfulness focused meditation types. And lifetime in years, you see they have nearly 20 years of experience on average, nearly 3,000 years, 3,000 hours of experience in their lifetime. And something like in the 8 weeks we ask, they on average meditated 4 hours in the last 8 weeks, per week in the last 8 weeks. And we had a 20-minute session where an intra-subject balanced design, where they either did a self-guided meditation of their own, what they knew to, how they knew to meditate. And then there was a control condition, we always need that, reading a relaxing passage from a novel in this body posture of meditation. Just trying to something grasp some sort of, and getting closer to what Tillman basically said. And little method section. So in this case, we had, as you see also how actually quite easy it can be with visual analog scale. So we asked, how often did you think about time? These were the same question we also used in the waiting time study. And how fast did time pass for you during your meditation session? So just visual analog scales. And then we asked about the sense of self, and there's a very good, recommendable scale by Dambrun from France, the perceived body boundary scale. You see on the upper part, and then there's one we devised ourselves a little earlier, a body intensity scale, which we also gave the meditators after meditation, referring to the session. So what were the results? So in the meditation session, people reported less attention to time, and they reported a faster time passage for this 20 minutes session. And in the meditation session, they also reported weaker body boundaries, but the intensity of the body itself was not changed, but only the body boundaries, which is a sign of meditation, of being in peak states of meditation, was weaker. And then we conducted another study. So this was now my meditation part, and talking about flotation rest, because the problem with meditation is you always need very experienced meditators, and you don't get them so easily. Some meditators don't want to participate actually, and then, but then you get some, and but still it's quite time consuming in getting these, and then you never know what's actually happening with these meditators, because they're also in a certain state which you don't grasp if you're not really a very experienced meditator yourself. So what I have now in my lab is a flotation rest device. Yeah, rest meaning restricted environmental stimulus technique, flotation. And what you have is, you see here, you open the door of, on the right, you see this, and you have 35 degrees warm water, salt water. It's Epsom salt, so magnesium sulfate, and where you really float, totally comfortable in this warm water. And then it's dark, you don't see anything, you don't hear anything. And basically you just have two modes of consciousness content. And one is interoception, you feel your bodily inners, your breathing, your heart. And of course, at the beginning, your mind wandering. What am I doing here? Oh, this is strange, and so on. And the initial experience is actually an increased awareness of time through this increased interoception. But at some point you get into, I would say, I like to call this instant meditation. You some sort of lose your sense of self and time, and because you get such a relaxed state, even with a decreased mind wandering. And so this is now our device we're looking at, and my doctoral student Helena Ruby, she collected this data. Now this is the fresh presentation, one of the first presentations of the data at all, where we see on the left our treatment with the flotation rest device, 60 minutes in this flotation, or, and this is a control condition, a bed rest, a water bed condition. Because people would always say, okay, but do you really need this very costly device of flotation rest? If you just lie comfortably on your bed, or in the bathing tub, maybe you get the same results. Therefore, you need really this control condition. And what we showed there was that we have stronger time distortion in flotation rest versus bed rest. Interestingly, there's an overestimation of duration in flotation rest versus bed rest, which we account for, let's say, this novelty effect of being in this flotation thing, which is like more interesting, and then you have more memory content. But, and that is also important, next to time distortion, we have a stronger loss of body boundaries in the flotation rest condition. So again, time distortion and body boundaries weaker. Final empirical slide, I'm coming to the end. Now we have also got to talk about psychedelics. I did two studies with Franz Vollenweider at the University of Zurich, using psilocybin. I'm not talking about this, was also with a duration reproduction task, and they showed that people would reproduce much earlier, press a button much earlier, so reproduce more short when they were under the influence of psilocybin. But what I want to highlight here is when they did an overview of their 400 subjects they had collected over decades with a certain questionnaire, the 5D ASC, looking at the subscale of oceanic boundlessness, you find this very strong item correlation between ego dissolution, dissolution of time, and feeling of disembodiment. And then Benny Shannon from Israel, he wrote a book, but this is also from an article. He talked about time distortions on ayahuasca, this South American brew. And I'm not talking about all these details. You see yourself, you have the different types of temporality and different modified ways of temporality. What can all happen with ayahuasca? There's a lot of things that can happen, but still he says peak experiences for him and for the subjects he looked at are always there's no time, no self. Okay, so just a final slide is the altered states of consciousness. I didn't talk so much on psychiatric symptoms. I didn't talk so much about the possibilities, how to use induction methods like psychedelics, flotation tank, and meditation for treating psychiatric syndromes. That would be a separate talk. But what you have in psychiatric symptoms, what I showed you earlier, is that you have this hyper-awareness of self and time, rumination, mind wandering, and the core features of altered states of consciousness, of course, are opposed to these subjective experience. So there's less awareness of self and time, and there's a decrease of mind wandering. So that's so important. So that is one way of interpreting these results we have with meditation, psychedelics, and flotation rest, why patients with psychiatry suddenly get into have a massive reduction of symptoms of their psychiatric disease. And on the going back to our neural correlates of self-perception, yeah. So what one can say, if you look at the literature, which has just evolved over the last years, that you have either downregulation or decreased connectivity with other brain regions in the posterior insular, posterior cingulate cortex, and precuneates, yeah, which could be termed as a network for the sense of I. And you have now these results for meditation, psychedelics, and flotation rest. So coming to the end, so what is subjective time? So basically, it's momentary time experience, self-body time, insular time, emotional time. So time consciousness and self-consciousness are very much related. Yeah? Think about Schelling, read Schelling, although it's actually quite torturing to read him. And this is just my final slide for you, to my collaborators and sponsors. Thank you for watching and listening.
Thank you so much, Marc. I didn't saw the time passing, so this means it's like it was really, really interesting, and I'm pretty sure everybody felt the same. Yeah, so this is fascinating, really fascinating. I have so many ideas, so many questions, but we'll discuss later. I want to ask if somebody in the audience has a question, and then can raise your virtual hand, and I can open the floor for you.
Anna, should we finish recording?
Oh, yeah, sorry, you're right. Thank you for reminding me.